Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Director of Research at FPRI, and it's great to have you all with us today for our event, From World Order to Earthly Order, Environmental Security in the 21st Century with Professor Saleem Ali. Before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to quickly thank all of our donors, members, supporters, and our Board of Trustees, without which these events wouldn't be possible. And for those of you who are not in those categories, I sincerely encourage you to check out some of the links that will be coming in the chat and consider supporting FPRI and our work down the line. We could not do anything that we do without your support, and we're really eager to welcome new people into our community. Today, as I said, we are here with Professor Saleem Ali, who is an FPRI Senior Fellow and the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware. And we're here to talk primarily about a new book that Professor Ali has published entitled Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life, which just came out in the last couple of months from Oxford University Press. We're also going to discuss a recent piece that he put together for us at FPRI about ecological implications of potential peace in Ukraine. And we're going to have a conversation between myself and Dr. Ali for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then after that point, we're going to turn to audience Q&A. But please, I just want to encourage folks to enter questions into the chat whenever they happen to strike you, and we'll sort of go through them and have plenty of time for that towards the end of the event, and we'll wrap this up within an hour. But first, welcome, Saleem. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to reconnect with FPRI, and I must also echo what you've said, that this is a really unique organization in the pantheon of think tanks. FPRI, I think, is a hidden gem in many ways. It's non-partisan, and it really puts forward some high-quality work, very empirically driven.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Saleem. And we're glad to have your high quality empirical work as part of that portfolio.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start actually with the topic of your most recent piece for FPRI, and I encourage people to read it if they haven't already. There should be a link to it going into the chat shortly. This piece was taught or titled "An Ecological Path to Peace is Possible in Ukraine." It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's a really fascinating, I think, really interesting proposition for the consideration of environmental and particularly resource-driven factors in a potential peace deal in Ukraine. I think there's been some conversation lately about, well, how creative are we going to have to get if there is stalemate in Ukraine, in one of the more recently occupied regions, or if there's no progress into Crimea, for instance, by the Ukrainian forces. What sort of considerations are we going to have to take into context, and what might any kind of peace deal or collaborative sharing of borders, what might the borders of a post-war Ukraine even look like? And Saleem, your recent article and your book really provide a lot of thought-provoking assertions about what could be possible, what precedents there might be for situations like this. And I just wanted to ask you a bit. Can you tell us what sorts of outcomes considering environmental security provides or could result in as a part of peace negotiations in the Ukraine conflict?
Sure. So the piece is titled "An Ecological Path" for a very particular reason. Why did I use the word ecology and ecological? Ecology, if you go back to the root of the term, it's about the relationship between organisms and the environment, living things and the environment, and certainly humans and the environment. And what I have argued both in Earthly Order as well as in a lot of my practical work in science diplomacy and serving on 2 UN panels related to science and resource issues, is that often decision-making is around geopolitical issues that are divorced from the natural science reality that we have on the ground. And that could be the physical geography of the area where the water is coming from. It could be around the patterns of resource flows. So that's why ecological is used. And then there is a second play on the term that it's also more logical in terms of how we approach this. So this is not pie in the sky thinking. It's very much predicated on the ground reality. And I should also, with reference to Ukraine, I should mention that I have been to Odessa. I was there in 2018. I know the Black Sea region fairly well. And also I have been to Russia twice, and including in one case in 2013, I had an opportunity to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the former foreign minister, the current foreign minister of Russia, and in a small group setting of scientists who were invited by the World Economic Forum to Russia to engage. This was before the unfortunate invasion of Crimea. I've written this piece with that background in mind, that this is something that is practical, and also recognizing that the way in which the Russians operate often is that if we are going to just play the long game, we are in for a lot of suffering. And I'm a pragmatist when it comes to mitigating human suffering. So some people may be very much like, well, why are you even suggesting this? How can we know there is no question that what Russia did was unacceptable under the norms of global behavior. But the reality is, how do we then navigate the situation in a way where we are able to hold on to our principles, but also mitigate loss of life as much as possible? So what I've argued for in this piece is looking at the natural science kind of reality of the situation, whether you think about the Black Sea region itself, the Crimean Peninsula itself, which is unusual in terms of most of the water supply of Crimea has come from the Dnieper River. And so there was an engineering solution that during Soviet times was made by making a canal. And then the canal later on also was utilized by Ukraine. And then, one of the things that happened after the 2014 invasion of Crimea was that the canal was shut off. And Russia made this argument that by depriving Crimea of water, there was a humanitarian issue. And they actually took the matter to the European Court of Human Rights and so on. And, that was never resolved, of course, because then they ended up getting into this larger conflagration in Ukraine. So what I've argued for is, if we think about it in those terms, there are ways in which we can find hybridity in solutions. And I've also given an example that in the case of the Georgian war, Russian-Georgian conflict, there was a hybrid solution, which we can look at, which was this territory of Adjara that became this kind of multi-governed space where there were still Russian troops, but it was not relinquished completely to Russian control by any means. And in fact, that has progressed to a point now where there is a much more workable outcome. So I've tried to present it in those terms. And what Earthly Order as a book does is it tries to change the conversation from one which is very focused on conventional notions of world order, where we are really focused on existing nation-state demarcations, to one which is much more hybrid and intersecting with natural order. Mm-hmm. And the book itself is divided into three parts: natural order, social and economic order, and political order, because I want to make sure I cover all that ground.
Right. And we're going to talk, I think, primarily about the last one there, political order, because it's what concerns us today. Yes. And it's great that you bring up the example of Adjara that you use in your piece. And there's numerous interesting precedents for this sort of thing that you assess that, have their own kind of spotty history within the book. There's fascinating examples from Yugoslavia, from Ecuador and Peru, about how, conflicts end with these borders that are, or at least conceptions of border regimes that are hybrid, recognize the porous nature of these things, take into consideration the surrounding natural environment and why that matters to the people that live on either side of the border. But nonetheless, you need more than political imagination to make these things happen.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to sort of ask you, beyond the precedents that we have, I mean, this is clearly a very transportable concept. I mean, this is something that we could apply to a number of different situations and conflicts across the globe. I want to give you an opportunity to maybe talk about examples that haven't reached this kind of solution yet, like the one in Ukraine, maybe elsewhere in the world, where you think similar kinds of considerations could produce a positive result.
Yes, so territorial conflicts in border zones are among the most ubiquitous in terms of international disputes. And so I'm originally from Pakistan. One of the areas that I have argued for a similar solution is the border region in the Karakoram Mountains between India and Pakistan, where the Siachen Glacier has been a location of conflict for the past since 1986. So it's important actually to decouple Siachen from the larger Kashmir conflict, which goes back more than 70 years to partition after the British Raj. But Siachen itself, which is this amazing non-polar glacier, the world's second largest non-polar glacier, became a point of conflict, largely because the demarcation that was put forward in a peace agreement was not clear enough. So the border, which was delineated in the peace agreement between, which was kind of not even, I wouldn't call it a peace agreement, but a kind of a ceasefire agreement that was negotiated in an earlier Pakistan-India conflict, did not make it clear enough as to which direction the border would be. It was like from henceforth to the glaciers. And it was like, okay, is that 90-degree angle to the where you are making it or which way? And that led to this dispute conflict. And what we've argued there is that this is a very valuable cryospheric environment from a natural science perspective, one which could be, and no one lives there. I mean, it's only valuable to mountaineers, really. We're talking about over 20,000 feet above sea level. Why not make this a zone, which is, we kind of set aside where the border is, similar to Antarctica, where countries laid aside their claims in the Antarctic Treaty. There were 7 countries that had claims to Antarctica, but they said, we'll put them aside and we're just going to cooperate on science. And let's just demilitarize and make that the focus. And, that is, I think, a very practical solution to Siachen. And it could also help to thaw relations between India and Pakistan on other matters. There's a similar border conflict on the southern side, which is older. It is pre-partition. That is on a creek in the Indus Delta. It's called the Sir Creek. And I wrote a piece for the Stimson Center as part of their off-ramps initiative for South Asia on how we could resolve that dispute. That's an even more absurd dispute because it's about whether the border should be in the middle of the creek channel or on the side. And those of us who know natural order and river deltas, they are constantly changing. So just the proposition that it should be in the middle or on the side is pretty absurd. But that's what led to that dispute. And we have this really sad situation where every year there's some fishermen who cross accidentally one side of the border or the other, and they get apprehended by either side. And then, they are released at some point later in some kind of bargain. And it's very unfortunate. That one could similarly be resolved because it's a very unique environment. From a natural order perspective, this is a wetland region. Both India and Pakistan have actually signed the Ramsar Convention on the Protection of Wetlands. So even under international law, they're obliged to support the conservation of wetlands. They could make it a transboundary protected area under the Ramsar Convention and say, it doesn't matter where the border is a protected area, we'll manage it jointly. And that would be it. But, so it's a matter of just thinking laterally and finding these solutions. That's what did happen in Ecuador and Peru. where there was a territorial dispute, and actually a very violent territorial dispute that had led to several conflicts over the years. And during the Clinton administration, the US and Brazil helped to mediate the resolution of the Cordillera del Condor conflict. And as part of the peace agreement, that region was made into an international conservation area that would be, managed jointly and with the assistance of Conservation International and the International Tropical Timber Organization. So it's, this is doable. It's not pie in the sky. It's not utopian thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's turning more to your book. I mean, the fascinating thing about it is it starts from this pretty heady concept and then gets into these very, very practical and logical sorts of solutions and examples. I wanted to give you a chance to explain a little bit more what you mean by this concept of earthly order. I mean, reading the book, I thought it makes a very forceful argument about the sorts of order making, or that the sorts of order making we're used to talking about in international relations and foreign policy are entirely too narrow, and that we sort of see political systems as merely a subset of a grander natural concept of order and disorder. You make great use and reference back to early Greek logic, moving through the development of natural laws and systems. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you don't ever hear talked about in international relations literature. So it's to me a very welcome and creative use of a scientific background to account for issues of world order and international relations. But I want to give you a chance to explain, sort of more in miniature what you mean by this earthly order concept.
Yeah, so the inspiration for this book partly came out of reading some of the works by Francis Fukuyama, for example, which many of your audience members would be aware of, who has written a book on political order. And, he's written actually a trilogy of books related to political order, but they are not at all connected, or does he have any interest in sort of the natural science underpinnings of how that order makes sense or it doesn't make sense in those ways. But they're very well researched and well argued books from a historical perspective, and then also reading books which are on complex systems from a science perspective, like James Glick's famous bestseller Chaos, or the book by Jeffrey West on Scale, that was also a New York Times bestseller. So you have these two genres of writings and nonfiction. You have the ones people writing on complex systems from a natural science perspective, and those who are writing on order from a political science perspective, and neither are talking to each other. So this book, Earthly Order, presents the narrative to bridge those two divides. And so what I mean by earthly order is a very practical way of governing the planet, which does not negate borders, but which operationalizes borders in a way where we are conscious of the underpinning natural realities of planetary boundaries when it comes to the way in which we are impacting sustainability indicators, for example. So I approach the book from that perspective of a vision for what planetary governance might be like in a way whereby we are both ecologically efficient and economically efficient in navigating our political systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that a lot as someone who comes from a background of Middle East history, where we're constantly studying or grappling with the border making in the region after World War I, which one of my colleagues referred to at one point as lines drawn on an empty map. And you pay a visit to some of these border regions as I have, and you're immediately struck by the natural surroundings, and you wonder why this border was drawn in the middle of the desert, not up by the mountains 100 kilometers to the north or something like that. This matters. The topography matters, the natural resources matter, and the environment matters to the way, conflicts around borders and political order and regional orders get shaped. Sort of building off of that, one of the things I found really powerful in your book was your explanation of the sort of deficits of economic and political developmentalism when they don't take into account natural resources or the earthly order, as you put it. In particular, you make a comparison between China and India that kind of kicks off the last part of your book on political order. Can you tell the audience why you think development in these two cases has come up short, and how the considerations that you suggest would improve things?
Yes, so this has been a constant comparison in the development literature, is that both of these countries, which are demographic giants, more than 1 billion people in either country, have had different political trajectories. One is a democracy, imperfect as it is, but very much a democracy in the case of India, and in the case of China, very much a Confucian autocracy currently, though the Confucian side of it is relatively recent in the last few decades. Certainly Mao didn't see himself as Confucian. But how they have tried to negotiate the development path with their population and make the argument for one political system versus another. And so I'm very conscious of the fact that when we, the arguments we make for having order in any political system is always going to involve certain trade-offs when it comes to participation, when it comes to going to the granularity of decision-making. And in complex systems, actually, this is where the science side comes in, understanding how much you can upscale and at what scale is it best to manage an entity becomes a very interesting question overall. So whether it is at the level of local government, do you make decisions at the executive level, where do and then what are the kinds of decisions that are going to be determined by science versus those which should be determined by the citizenry at large? So what should be the role of technocracy versus more pristine democracy, where you are getting everyone's view? And China has always made the argument of technocracy that has been, that there are certain guideposts where we need to let the technocrats make the decisions. And in the case of India, it has been much more around, well, we should follow the democratic process and whatever that leads to a large degree. So what I argue for, again, is that we need to be able to have some kind of global mechanism whereby there is a recognition that there are certain fundamental boundaries. If we're going to cross them from based on the best science available, that everyone is going to be worse off. And so we need to present in that same way. We don't have any mechanism for that, and that's why you have this divergence between India and China moving forward as well. Whether I come out in favor of one versus the other, I clearly am much more on the side of having participation, but I do make it clear that there are going to be points at which, if there's a huge trade-off in terms of how much participation is going to lead to ecologically efficient outcomes, as long as we are willing to do that. I mean, there's this, Ken Arrow told us about the voters paradox. We have Amartya Sen's famous essay on impossibility of a Paretian liberal, that in a totally liberal society, you can never have Pareto optimality because of these factors. As long as we're willing to accept that. Now, if, that's okay. And if we are not willing to accept that, then at some point we need to say, okay, for these matters, we really need to have some technocratic mechanism for decision-making. So I think both India and China can learn from each other in that regard. And there are areas where certainly having much more participation is going to be valuable because it creates more resilience if you make a mistake. But if you have very clear established science, then having participatory decision-making can be a recipe for paralysis in terms of decision-making overall. And some of my other empirical work is, for example, on mining and mineral development. And we're seeing that, that right now it's so difficult to start a new mining project because when it comes to, you can present the best science, but there's the NIMBY problem, the not in my backyard problem, that will prevent people from ever agreeing to it. You can present them all the science saying there's going to be the mitigation and all that, and you'll be fine and safe. Nuclear power is another one. You can present all the science and people are going to have a gut reaction. So where do you then end up deciding? And this happened in Germany. They had to make an executive decision recently on nuclear power. They didn't do a referendum and ask people, are we going to continue the nuclear power plant for another 6 months? They just had to do it because that made technocratic sense. And they were trying to actually correct, I would say, the mistakes that they made in the past by an emotional decision to phase out nuclear power too fast without having a plan on transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how you frame it like that. I mean, these kinds of problems can be scaled down to neighborhood precincts in Brooklyn and scaled up to the COP summits, like and it's true, because these systems are all complex in so many different ways. I have one or two more questions for you, but I just want to remind folks once again, we'll have time in about 5 or 10 minutes to move to audience questions. So please, whenever the mood strikes you, please pop something into the Q&A box. We'll get to them in turn. So Saleem, in the framework for order that you set out, what do you see as, you were hinting at this just a little bit in your response to my last question. What do you see as the role of leadership in world affairs, either by individual powerful states or international organizations or private organizations? How ought the conception of earthly order shift the way such entities act in reality, and how might we expect the pace of change on so many of these critical fronts to adjust in response?
Yeah, I mean, I think with overall, we have to go to the psychology of why, human behavior responds to certain forms of leadership. And in complex systems, we have this notion of what we call attractors, where people just any complex phenomenon, even chemical reactions, they tend to cluster sometimes around certain attractors. And so leadership in many ways is analogous to that kind of phenomenon where people will go and cluster around. There's, whether you call it herd mentality or whether something, when we have to try and understand what leads to that. And there's this term called the Matthew effect also, which is about, and I talk about this in the book, and it goes back to the Gospel of Matthew, where there's this conversation around, that people who are successful will become more successful than those who are not. So this is, and this is how fashion happens. This is how celebrities emerge. And so I'm very conscious that leadership should, if we start to take on that aspect of leadership, which is what often happens in the political sphere, and that's why you get clustering of certain political parties and populist leaders emerging in certain way. It's the same happens with business leaders. The same happens with university presidents. You have the same, the stars, the MacArthur Fellows, the Guggenheim Fellows. In academia, it happens the same way. The same people then keep getting the awards and so on, And so we have to figure out a way that from a technocratic point of view, we are able to have a more devolved mechanism for getting excellence to shine. And so I am much more of a fan of that kind of devolved leadership and organically around solutions that we need for the planet. And thankfully, that's where technology has helped. I mean, I think technology has been very empowering of getting some of those ideas much more to rise. There is still the Matthew effect operating. You still have certain YouTubers who are going to do better than others. But the fact that you can even have those YouTubers, where before you wouldn't even have that space, is a very positive thing. So I think we need to think about leadership in the same way. And I would be much more for a broader canvas of leadership in that regard than the old vision of leadership of the Winston Churchills and so on and so forth. Because then you are really going to end up getting constrained. Given in a complex system, you need so many other factors to come and resolve those.
Yeah, and what's again so interesting about your book is you highlight these areas of success for this kind of decision making, this kind of policy making, that often don't seem to be filtering up to the highest level, even if major governments are involved. I mean, you make a very compelling case about the U.S.-Canadian border, and the way that has been constructed around lakes for so we have shared governance, and you contrast that with the inability to affect that kind of border regime between the United States and Mexico. So I think it's curious, or it's a difficult problem to solve, in that respect. I wanted to ask you about, you bring up Ian Bremmer's sort of J curve in terms of, political development and, democracy and that sort of thing. But you also mentioned the sort of backsliding possibilities, right? And of course, working on the Middle East, backsliding is like the word of the day, whether it's, Egypt or Turkey or elsewhere in the region. I'm curious to know, even personally, like, we don't immediately think of the ecological factors in authoritarian backsliding. We don't immediately think of, how these things might be conditioned, or what, ecological factors underpinned these kinds of backsliding events. And I'm wondering if you have any insight, having done a little bit of work in the region. I know you've worked on Israel, Palestine as well, about how you might see, an earthly order underpinning or overseeing or impacting some of these events.
Yeah, I mean, I think with reference to the J curve, for those of your audience who might not be familiar with it, it's basically looking at the level of democracy versus stability. The argument being that if you have extremely autocratic states, they're stable. And then as they become more open, they become more slightly unstable. But you want ultimate stability begins to rise as you open the societies completely. And then, so there's this kind of teething trouble, so to speak, where the trough of the J is. And so a society like North Korea would be on one extreme, which is, relatively stable, but clearly very autocratic. And then you have, as you become a little bit more open, you get, slightly more attrition, and and you have examples of countries which have opened up slightly, and then certainly that has happened with China to some degree, as we saw with the recent protests and so on, that has been able to. And so, and then you move on into democracies. Now, when it comes to environmental factors, environmentalism and natural resources have become part of populist struggles, much more so in the last 2 decades. So we are seeing that also across political spectra. So, for example, in Serbia, we had opposition to a lithium mine that was to open there. That came from the political right, just as much from the political left. And it became such a huge problem for the country that eventually the mine was rejected. And it was because of this confluence of the environmental, with the sort of NIMBYism that was coming forth. But what I would say, the sad part of it is that a lot of these environmental movements are not looking at a systems perspective of ecological issues. And that's one of the goals of Earthly Order, is also, it's not just targeted at people who are not familiar with environmental issues. In fact, it's more targeted at people who claim to have environmental learning and have a very shallow understanding of environmental knowledge. And so I often say in public gatherings, we have a lot of environmental awareness, but we don't have environmental literacy. And so the book is partly aimed at that if you really want to solve global environmental challenges, you have to recognize what those trade-offs will be. You have to understand how you measure risk. What are the ways in which we quantify risk and so on? And so I think that part comes forward. And this book was written with a mission partly, and I've dedicated it to my students because I teach, at a public university and I've chosen to remain at a public university because I feel I get access to a very wide demographic of the population, and to be able to give them a sense of the depth around system science that they should have. That, okay, why is it that for nuclear power, this makes sense in this context, but not in that context? And so I'm actually donating all royalties from this book for environmental education programs, because I am very concerned that we don't have, we have all kinds of other requirements in universities and high schools, but we don't have an environmental literacy requirement. And we have people who are getting into immense positions of power, who do not have any understanding of the fundamental life support systems on which we depend ultimately. We cannot escape those. So I think that feeds into this aspect of the stability and populism problem, that we just have, a very shallow understanding.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, and I can see many different applications of this, tension between environmentalism and environmental security, which ought to work in tandem, but as you point out, don't often enough. Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to encourage folks to shoot questions into the Q&A. We don't have any there quite yet, so we're gonna charge on, Saleem. So I was struck by another example that you brought up in the piece. Actually, I wanted to come back since I brought up the last question about Middle East. I'm not sure we got there.
I can talk about Middle East also. Sorry, I didn't.
Sorry,
if you want me to go into, yeah.
But
happy to go into.
Yeah. So you attended this quite a prominent conference a number of years ago around with youth leaders. If I'm not mistaken, if I'm pulling the example correctly from the book, or from Israel and Palestine, sort of thinking around potential solutions to the conflict. And you had a really interesting perspective on what the outcomes of that relatively banal exercise were, and what we might draw from that. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, so with the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I should say, part of it is around understanding the contestation to land in land linked to identity. And in the book, I talk about the way in which borders, identity, and order are connected. And the way forward, if you were to think of it in hybrid solution terms, that makes the most sense, is a confederation where it's not a one state or a two-state solution, but it is a confederation between two entities that both claim legitimacy and identity to the land. And who came first becomes irrelevant in that context. And a confederation model allows for that to exist. And actually there has been, and I talk about this in the book, that there have been some, visionaries who have proposed that. There's a lawyer in Los Angeles, Joseph Avisar, who has been, proposing this for many years. And he even set up a virtual Israeli-Palestinian confederation, which is in line with that kind of notion of more of an earthly order around these issues. And, he's proposed all of these and got some very, leading politicians on either side to actually say this is what makes sense. In fact, if you are going to also perpetuate, keep, the settlements and all of these other factors, this is the only way it's going to work. Otherwise, the only other option is it's might is right. It's basically that's the only thing that will end up, is whoever is going to have more power is going to assert their control. And it's not a long-term solution, which is likely to be advantageous for either side, I think, in terms of human relations by any means, but even down the road, it can very well erupt into further conflict. So, so I think then the other side of this is about some of the ways in which the environment can play a role in trust building in the Middle East. And that has been tried originally. There's a group called like EcoPeace Middle East, which their goal is that, okay, at least Palestinians, Israelis, they can't get along on other matters, but on the environment, they have to share the environment. Let's get them together, and that will build trust, and maybe that will spill over into other things. There's the Arava Institute in Israel, which brings, Palestinians together with Israelis on a kibbutz, and they do environmental education together. And in theory, as someone who has worked with environmental peace building, I think that should work, and it has worked in other cases. But unfortunately, I think in the Middle East conflict, there is so much fatigue with such initiatives, with track 2 and all, that I do not think it is now adding the same value that it used to. Mm-hmm. I think there was a window where there was a lot of hope where these kinds of initiatives would actually lead to this. I was involved in a training program in Spain where we would get people from all across the Middle East together for 6 weeks. And we would do environmental learning together in Toledo, which was a city of 3 cultures historically, of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And it was funded by the Foundation for 3 Cultures in Spain, and El País, the founder of El País, one of Spain's major newspapers. And, I think we made an impact at that time when there was still hope and people were talking. There was a lot of crying. There was a lot of learning through that process, especially like with Lebanese participants in many cases who had taken risks to meet Israelis. They were not even, allowed to at the time. But I think we are now sadly in a phase of the conflict where there is a lot of cynicism, and because there's a feeling that all of this is a means of co-opting the narrative and not really actually moving to action. So at this point, I feel as though we need something more substantive at the political settlement level, which I think, in my view, the Confederation would be the best option.
Yeah, of course, with these sorts of confederations, the devil is always in the details, isn't it? And we've actually talked recently in some of our programming here about possible confederative solutions to the conflict in Afghanistan. And it's one thing in a country that has that kind of scale, that kind of geographic diversity. It's another thing in a country basically the size of New Jersey, like Palestine, Israel, with only more limited.
I think it would be easier there. The other example of a confederation is Switzerland. It's a smaller country, mountainous country, and then one which has worked and has a very great history of. And if you look at the way it works, the cantons, the decision making, it's tough to get laws passed in Switzerland because of the role the cantons play. There's a lot of autonomy. Sure. So I think it's actually easier at a scale geographically, which is smaller. I think it'll be much more difficult in Afghanistan to do it. Afghanistan, I do talk about Afghanistan also in the book, but it's a different dynamic. I think we made a huge blunder earlier on in terms of not thinking about a hybrid solution for Islamic governance to be managed within the larger country, where there could have been a way. When we knew we couldn't win militarily, there was an opening where we could have still kept our space, allowed the Taliban to have some self-governance in specific parts of the country. And for those people who were really so taken by Islamic law, they could have gone there, but it would have been managed under the condition that they would allow those who did not want it to go to the other part. And that would have been, and that would have been able to contain the situation rather than then just leaving within a matter of 2 months, which was a complete fiasco. But it would have allowed for a much more workable context to develop. And I actually wrote an article in Foreign Policy some years ago where I got a lot of hate mail for it. But then later people told me, actually, if we had done this much earlier, we would not have ended up in this mess that we are in now.
Right. I was referencing that part of the book where you get a little bit of shine, well, under quite unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah, sadly, I
human
wish I
rights.
was not. I mean,
No, absolutely.
it breaks my heart as, someone who in Pakistan, we have welcomed over 3 million Afghan refugees, and Afghanistan is very near and dear to me, but it's just so sad what's happened.
We do have one question from the audience, and I'm going to read it back to you, Saleem, so that our viewers who are watching later on YouTube get it captured. This is coming from Bren Pripatok. It says, the idea of border management by concordance is fascinating and possibly not utopian at all. I wonder what your prescription might be for the US-Mexico border region. Might be, given immigration issues and the quasi system of a dozen or so paired cities along the border. What are the implications of this, or how might funding work? What kind of international organizations might be involved? I might add to that.
Yes, no, thank you, Ben. Yeah. We do have, of course, under what used to be NAFTA, now we have the new version of NAFTA, the Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, Canada-America-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, that we basically have some economic transcendence of borders through that. And actually, under the old NAFTA, there was the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, which was set up, and it's headquartered in Montreal. It's still there. It was disempowered quite a bit in the previous administration, but they're there, and they're being, I think, they're being revived in certain project development. So I do see an opportunity for that Commission on Environmental Cooperation, which was mandated to promote such cross-border activities on both sides of the border, could move forward on such efforts. So the Rio Grande Basin, particularly from an environmental point of view, huge issues in terms of side, the Colorado River itself, which enters Mexico and becomes a trickle. There are all these, we have these also transboundary water issues. That could be another mechanism whereby there could be some greater engagement. But what would be really interesting is also to have opportunities for families who have been separated because of the situation, to have a safe space to meet. There are these old photographs you may come across online when there used to be, near Tijuana, there was this place where families could come together on weekends, and it was like a kind of a safe space for people to meet, and there was security outside it, but they were able to at least connect and meet in that space. I think some arrangements like that would be really valuable for people who have been separated because of these situations. And there's a photograph actually during the Nixon years of Patty Nixon, meeting these people across the border. And I think we should think slowly about those kinds of opportunities on the Mexican border side. Of course, the situation with the drug war has made things much more difficult to manage, and so we would need to confer with our friends in Homeland Security about what would be practical. But I think that's something that should be thought of in the long run. I believe that on the Mexican side, you will find a lot of receptivity to it if we approach them.
I wanted to ask you, since you're involved outside of your many duties as a professor and writing these books in a number of UN initiatives, panels, and government-oriented work around that applies a lot of the principles and work that you're doing in a book like Earthly Order. And considering, reading the book, it's very clear that this was a book that was getting completed towards the tail end of the Trump administration, and now we're 2 years into the Biden administration. I want to ask you, so what has your experience been, on a sort of a practical level, in a sort of across that transition? There was a lot, it would seem, from a layman's perspective, a lot of rollback in the Trump era of environmental protections and cooperation on environmental issues. environmental security and environmentalism seem to be deprioritized both. And then, Biden sort of came in looking to restore, not only these policies, but so many more, and has had very, very mixed success so far. But I'm curious what your experience has been like across this transition, and if there's any, in your mind, pressing issues coming up in the near horizon that the administration ought to focus on with these considerations in mind.
Yeah, no, I think that overall, we should make the environment a non-partisan issue, and it's very unfortunate it has become the way it has, because I always give the example of the EPA being established during a Republican president during the Nixon administration. I give the example even of, and I mentioned this in Earthly Order, there is a book written by Newt Gingrich called Contract with the Earth. He was famous for the contract with America, but he also authored a book called Contract with the Earth, and it has a cover endorsement from E.O. Wilson, who was one of the great doyens of environmental science, and the late E.O. Wilson, a professor at Harvard, who wrote his cover endorsement. This is the guy who coined the term, by some people's measurement, biodiversity. Tom Lovejoy and E.O. Wilson are both credited with that. And he wrote an endorsement for Newt Gingrich's book. So, I don't like to demonize either side. I think we need to be very careful in the rhetoric we use. Ultimately, I think all sides, they value nature. It's just how it's operationalized. And sometimes they do it in ways, like I was saying with the Serbian conflict, you get extreme elements there. You had, in the case of the mine in Alaska, Donald Trump Jr. opposed the mine in Alaska because it was going to mess up his fishing buddies and hunting grounds and all that. So you get these strange alliances around nature, because people ultimately, as humans, we all have what E.O. Wilson called biophilia. We love life in some form or another. So I think that's what we should focus on. And I do hope that in Congress, people start to think about it in those terms, that we go to a nonpartisan approach to environmental issues, which sadly got derailed because we started to focus on nature in very specific terms around climate change. And unfortunately, I am all for climate mitigation. I work constantly on trying to reduce emissions, but I don't think we can reduce all environmental issues to carbon footprints, which is unfortunately what has happened. And it's become the litmus test for people's proximity to nature, which it shouldn't be. And that is what has led to more polarization. So within the Biden administration, some of that, as part of the electioneering, they did the same. But I do think that the administration is willing to work across the aisle on environmental issues if there is that greater recognition around other aspects of nature, the longer term vision of natural capital, also providing financial capital and economic development, green growth, as we call it. I think that is very much the way forward that the Biden administration should do. And I do believe they're beginning to work in that direction. The other part, which has been a little bit more challenging, has been this situation with international relations and China, especially, where because of the deterioration in relations, we have had an unwillingness to consider ecological efficiency of where supply chains come from. And in fact, myself and I see in the audience actually Sofia Kalantzakos, who is on the faculty at NYU, and she and we collaborated on an article recently with a range of colleagues, which focused on this issue of mineral supply security for green technologies. And if we really want to be ecologically efficient, we really can't get there without having some kind of cooperative relationship with China if we are serious about meeting those timelines for the green transition. So we laid out the data in this article in Environmental Science and Technology that just came out. And it was the result of a workshop at Caltech that Sophia had organized with colleagues from all over the world. So I think that I am still a little bit uncomfortable with the Biden administration's approach, because it's been all about, well, we have to just focus on US producing everything. And sometimes US producing everything is not going to be ecologically efficient. Even US friends producing everything may not be necessarily efficient. So, I'm also an Australian citizen. I know Australians have another advantage in terms of their resource economy, and they can be, but they're really far away. And there's a transport cost if you're going to have certain supplies coming from certain areas. Where are the smelters? Where's the clean energy source which are going to supply the energy for those minerals being refined? And so, we have to think as a system as to, we build resilience, we diversify supply, but we don't want to start to exclude sources of green transition supply just because we've got, a tiff with someone right now. So I think that's what we need to work on.
No, and look, I mean, that points up, I think, a lot of the concerns everyone has around really the two conflicts, that I think are soaking up so much attention right now. One we've talked about already, Russia and Ukraine. The other, China and Taiwan, which our Asia program has been paying a lot of attention to. It's so critical that we avoid conflict there, precisely because of the sorts of disruptions that may result, and they're not just ecological or economic. They're not just around consumption habits. They're very squarely ecological and environmental questions. Saleem, we're running up against time, but thank you so much for joining us here today. Congratulations on a fantastic book. I want to thank everybody who's made it out for joining us today. If you missed it or you want to review it, it's going to be up on our YouTube page in the next day or so. You can check it out there. And please, if you are not already a member, a supporter, a donor, please consider giving us a donation through our website. The links are in the chat. We really couldn't do this without your support. Saleem, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
It's great having you.
All the best. Thank you. Bye.